Welcome to the Leaders in Payments podcast, where we talk to C-level leaders from across the payments landscape. We'll be discussing the products and services that impact the payment space today, as well as trends and predictions for the future of payments. We will also hear stories from our guests about their journeys to the top.
Hi, Motie. Thank you for being here and welcome to the show.
Hi, Greg. Thank you for having me back.
Absolutely. So this is the second of 4 episodes in March about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And we have the pleasure of speaking with Motie Brigg again. He was on the show back in early January. So to learn more about PPRO, I suggest you go back and listen to that episode, which is episode 287. So let's start out by talking a little bit about you and PPRO, and then we'll dive into the meat of the conversation. So if you don't mind, tell us briefly about yourself and a little about your professional journey.
Thanks, Greg. For those not familiar with PPRO or myself, I'm Motie Brigg. I'm the CEO here. PPRO is a company that specializes in local payment methods. The mission is to reach consumers and enable services anywhere around the globe. Core markets are European markets, where we do local payment methods, and Latin America, so Brazil, Mexico, Argentina. About me, I joined PPRO a year ago, and I took over as CEO 6 months ago, and spent all my career in payments, 22 years of payments experience, from merchant to PSPs, and obviously now here at PPRO.
And for those, again, listening, I think if you want to learn more about the details of PPRO, markets they serve, products, unique differentiators, all those kind of things we definitely covered in episode 287. So again, I suggest you go back and listen to those. So let's go ahead and jump into the meat of the conversation. So studies by McKinsey & Company find that companies with more diverse workforces perform better financially. And there's a direct correlation identified between diverse workforces and higher profits. So more specifically, companies that are in the top quartile for racial and ethnic diversity are 35% more likely, and those with gender diversity are 15% more likely to perform above the national average financially. So knowing that companies with a more diverse workforce perform better as the backdrop for our conversation, let's just start at the 100,000 foot level. So what is your view on this topic? Like, how do you define diversity, equity, and inclusion?
Yeah, and I think, a couple of months ago, you and I met and we were talking about me as a CEO and PPRO. And at the end of it, you mentioned that you're doing a piece on diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I got very excited because it's a topic very close to my heart. And it's close to my heart not because of the statistics that you just mentioned, but because I genuinely believe in the importance of diversity, equity, and inclusion in the workforce, in different companies. I think everywhere I have worked in, where there was inclusion, definitely, and diversity of people from different backgrounds and ideas have flourished. And I spoke about last time, as a gay person and a gay leader, inclusion was always very important for me to feel accepted and part of the conversation and the understanding of why diversity is so key for what companies do and want to achieve. And I think the diversity, it means for me, the ability to not just respect and accept people, whatever walks of life they come from, but also what you're trying to achieve as a business and the culture you're trying to build, the openness to not just different types of people, but also different ideas and different strategies the business can adopt.
And you mentioned, and I think it's actually on your website, so I think it's probably part of the DNA, but you mentioned having a diverse and inclusive workplace is something that actually sets you apart. So you see it as a differentiator. So to me, I assume that means that it's just part of your DNA. So is that true, one? And then if so, how does that happen? How do you make that part of your DNA?
It's true. It's on our website for a reason. It's something that I think we recognize is really important. So, PPRO, we believe in accessing different markets. So we have offices in many, many locations, and we try to simplify to our customers. So we need to understand those markets and their different needs. And I think for us, it came from 2 different places. Number one is the actual DNA of the company in terms of proposition, and the second, the people that work here, and then how you combine the 2 of them into something quite powerful. We have actively pursued diversity, equity, and inclusion ways of working and policies. We're not there yet in terms of where we want to get to, but we have a strategy in place of how we make sure that we become even more diverse, more inclusive, with a real meaningful structure around it.
So do you have specific programs or initiatives around DE&I?
Yeah, we do. So I think what we have done was first understand the baseline. So do an analysis based on the information we have in front of us of the workforce that we have around the globe, with the limitations that come with it. So as you can imagine, based on different local regulations, different countries, there are different types of questions that you can or cannot ask your workforce. So we're trying to get a much deeper understanding of who works for us, and then what do we need to do to have a more diverse and inclusive work environment. So I'll give you an example. For the number of people we have, we're quite diverse when it comes to nationalities and backgrounds of languages, etc. But if you actually look into then how that translates to representations of women in different roles or Black people, different religions, etc., you see a diversion for where we should be. So what we then do is try and figure out what do we need to have in place to enable a program in place that will allow us to get to where we want to go. So where we want to get to, the end result should be a true representation of the different segments in society, in the company, in different levels in the company. And then what we do is build a program around recruitment. So making sure that there's no bias in the ads you put in place, to the interview process, to the hiring process. Bias could be on gender, it could be on any other form. So making sure that we're addressing that. You look into your promotion cycles and how you go about that, and how you make sure that you create an environment where people with children find that the work environment is flexible enough for them to be able to move up, or other groups, and really make sure that we take all that into account while we build our workforce and set it up for that future.
So how do you know or make sure that these programs are successful? Are there metrics, or is there ongoing tracking? What do you do, to make sure that they're working and successful and meeting the goals that you have for them?
What we do already is we track. So we do have metrics. We can see exactly what is the split between some of the key metrics. So I think the easiest one, as you can imagine, would be gender. It's always easier to do that. Even on gender, though, we're trying to evolve, and get more to then the male-female, but get into a much wider range of gender definitions, and then look into how we can expand into other groups that should have representation in the company, and then present it back to the employees as well as to our investors, shareholders, so there's a full insight and accountability. We're also tracking, based on specific KPIs, the recruitment, how many different groups we have recruited over a period of the last 12 months in the different parts of the business, so we can then go and see how we're doing on tech versus finance versus operation versus commercial. So we're actually doing the split for all the different groups that we have in the organization. And then we're trying to look forward and see where we need to go. Now, it's always really tricky, because what you don't want to do is you want to try and force adjustments, but you don't want to force it to the point where it becomes the only thing you're doing. It needs to be part of, you still want to make sure that you recruit the right talent, that they follow the principles that we have as a business, and they bring in the knowledge and experience that we need to have here. But you want to make sure that as you do all that, you have a strategy around diversity that is part of your recruitment process.
Yeah, and we'll talk about that in a little more detail in a minute. But also, not only are you doing, these things, tracking and reporting out, and maybe those are some of the best practices. But, if you were speaking to another CEO at a company and they were asking you, sort of, what are the best practices? Is there maybe a top 2 or 3 best practices that helps to ensure these things are successful?
Don't embark on diversity, equity, and inclusion journey if you're not serious about it and you don't mean it, because it needs to be part of everything you do. So it's not an exercise you do because it looks good. It's something you do because you genuinely believe in it. So I think that's where you have to start. Then I think you have to have a good look in the mirror and reflect on what's working, what's not working in your business, and identify where you have gaps and why the gaps are there. And then I think for us, culture has been key. So make sure that you have the right culture in place. Make sure that you have the right training for the people in the teams. I think recruitment policies are really important. I think having the right values or principles that encourage openness and inclusion are key. I don't think that it's one policy that you can have in place that is going to make it a more diverse or promote it better. I think it touches everything you do in the business. It needs to be part of everything you do, not just as a standalone, if you want, procedure or process.
Do you have any type of training or classes or anything for the leadership team that you see works or doesn't work?
Yeah, I think training is really important. I think awareness first to the fact that we all have a bias is key. And all of us have it. I don't think that there's any, because that's the way we're born and raised. And so we need to acknowledge that all of us will have it in us, that it can manifest itself in different ways based on where we are and who we're talking to, etc. And then there's a huge need to make sure that you have the right training in place for people, especially if you look at our teams are global teams. So you can have people from different countries managing people from other countries, different cultures, religions, belief system, and motivators, etc. So you need to make sure that there's a complete understanding and sensitivity to all that, and make sure that you take all that into account when you have one-to-one with your team, you give people feedback, you receive feedback, etc. So we're investing a lot of time and effort into that. We had a senior leadership team last week in Munich, spending a couple of days precisely on everything to do on how you transform business and the culture and how you're building the right attitude and how you do it in the most inclusive way where everyone's voices can be heard and respected and take part in the conversation. So you don't have one dominating or one that is determining how everything is going to look.
Do you have any sort of feedback loop? Do you do surveys to employees to kind of get a sense of what they're feeling and how the culture is growing? I mean, obviously you've grown a nice sized business. So just curious if there's a sort of a feedback loop.
Yeah, we do. We had our first, since I took over as CEO, we did it at the middle of January. And we have the first kind of results coming out of it. Diversity, equity, and inclusion was part of it. Part of it in two different areas. One is we have it as part of our principle. So where are we doing in terms of tracking to the principle? And the second is part of kind of ENPS scoring, as many companies do with their employees. So I think that was the first, for me as a newer, almost 6 months in role CEO, it's a good kind of a starting point that we can then go every quarter, every 6 months and measure and see how we're doing against it. But we did it last month and the results, I'm quite happy to share. Well, far from perfect. We do have a long way to go. I think when we have it as part of our principle, we scored okay, but it's clear that we need to do a lot more work to promote it internally. And there's some questions and comments on what does that mean to us? How will we make sure that there is more diversity? What do we have in place for that? So we're doing a lot of work around it also internally in terms of visibility around some of the stuff that we have in place now and some of the training and kind of sensitivities that we show around both recruitment, one-to-ones that we're having, and cultural changes.
Great. You touched on this earlier, so I want to circle back to it about sort of the hiring process, because I think this is important. It's something we've talked about in past years. But you've built this diverse and inclusive workplace culture, so there's no hiding it. I mean, it is part of the DNA of the company. So how do you ensure when you're hiring someone that they're going to thrive in that type of culture?
So I think it's really important to have so the whole process of recruiting people have to take into account the need to be an inclusive workplace and challenge each other about who we recruit and why. So making sure that teams are not all the same, that you have different types of personalities, different backgrounds, different, a good mix of people. And then I think what I'm trying to do with the executive team and our senior leadership team is help make sure that culture that is inclusive and embracing, diversity is really part of the day-to-day conversations that we have here in the office, that we celebrate the different, that we not just acknowledge it, but understand what's the benefit that we have when we are a diverse work environment. So how do we do that? We shared the stats on our diversity with the whole business in December. So we had a monthly town hall, and we shared the stats of where we are, and we shared the stats of where we want to go. We explained to people why we want to ask them more questions about who they are so we can have an even more diverse work environment. and why we want them to feel comfortable to share the information with us, and on confidentiality basis, of course, so not open service, you can imagine. So we do a lot of work around that, and I think it's really important that when people go through the recruitment process and the onboarding process, you acknowledge their uniqueness and what they bring as individuals to a business. And we're quite lucky, right? Like, we're not a massive business. We don't have thousands of people, so we can make sure that everyone feels and being treated as a unique individual.
Well, one of my goals with this series is to have others learn from industry leaders like you and who have built this type of culture or are building it. So what I want to do is kind of break out this by size, the types of companies, and get your advice sort of for each one. So let's say you're a real small company and you're just building a culture. What would your advice be to them? What would you tell them to maybe focus on initially, since they're, small and maybe don't have, the DE&I is maybe, small part of what they do because they're a small company. But obviously, if they want to grow into that, what would your advice be for them?
I don't think that size of the business should stop you from having, diversity, equity, and inclusion mindset. You might not need to have the same type of policies in place. It doesn't need to be, a whole department that runs it. But a mindset of diversity and inclusion is really, really important. You can do it with a business of 3-4 people. You don't need more than that, because the minute you have more than one person, you have different people from different walks of lives and different experiences. And I think you have to, if you appreciate that and you take that into account when you bring people into the business, and you see the benefit in having different ways of thinking, different ways of looking at the world, then you're already on track to having a diverse workforce. Inclusivity it's about building the right culture, allowing people to have an opinion that is different to yours, and having conversations that are done with respect and empower people to share their viewpoint. So again, I think a leader of a smaller business in many ways can make that decision. And I think a lot of the time is small businesses will say, well, I need to have the right talent. Having the right talent, if they all look and sound the same, is not necessarily having the right talent. It means that you're less open to people that be different to you. So you always should look around you and see if you're surrounded by the same types, it means that you don't have the right mindset for diversity and inclusion.
Yeah, I love the fact that you talk about the mindset, because I think that's so important. Well, let's move up. Let's say medium-sized companies, and I know you said like size of the companies don't matter, but I think once you start growing as a company and you have 100 employees or whatever the number is, then you start. I feel like you almost have to start making it more of a deliberate effort, as opposed to, with a very, really small, it can be more organic. So what would you say to kind of a medium-sized company? What advice would you give them?
I think when I didn't mean it, it doesn't matter in so much as I think it's easier in many ways when you have a smaller company or a big company. I think mid-sized companies tend to kind of fall in between. And I would put PPRO in that bracket, right? Like, we're a few hundred people. We're not in the thousands. We're not just a handful. And a lot of the time, these are the kind of companies that don't invest enough in diversity, equity, and inclusion because we're too busy in thinking like, oh, I need to hit my revenue targets, or I need to make sure that I hire the best person. And, I don't really need to worry about that because we're not visible enough. But these are the most important companies, I think, because we set the scene for a huge amount of, market share is massive. A lot of younger people come and work in our size companies because they find it more attractive. We're not as intimidating as the big companies. So it's really important that you have the right procedures in place. I do think when you're a mid-sized company, you need to have, you mentioned mindset, 100% you need to have the right mindset for that. But you also need to make sure that you have a people function that have it as a key part of their agenda. And you start having data that you feel comfortable to share. And share internally, because you're not a public company, you don't have to share it. But I think if you're accountable to the people in your business about it, then it becomes part of the language everyone is talking and everyone's thinking. There's a process of humility that comes with it, because when you start looking at it, it's not easy and it's never great. All of us, all businesses, including us, have a lot of work to do and a long way to go until we get to where we should be. So there's a process of having to admit to it But then you have to commit. You have to commit to doing the work, and you have to make sure that you have a plan, short-term, mid-term, and long-term plan with different checkpoints so you can go back to and reflect on what you wanted to do and whether you managed to get there or not, and set goals for the next round. But I think that's key for mid-sized companies probably, because it's easier for these kind of size companies not to have the right strategy in place.
Well, let's turn to larger enterprises where, it doesn't just become a checkbox kind of thing, right? How does it really get infused into how a company operates? What's your thoughts on the larger enterprises?
I think the most important thing is that it's not a checkbox exercise, because people in the team would notice it in seconds. I think mid-size or large companies, it is very much on the leadership and the senior leadership to be role models. And if you're a very big business, big companies, your people function should very much make sure that there's right training in place and to raise awareness among the executives and senior leaders on the right way to behave and look at things and speak and be ambassadors for diversity, equity, and inclusion.
One question that I kind of thought of as you were talking, and we really didn't plan on talking about this, but I want to bring it up, is how do your customers view this? Like, do you actively engage with customers about this culture that you've built? Do you think it makes a difference in companies wanting to do business with you, or do you think that it's more of an internal thing as opposed to an external thing?
It's not just an internal thing. So I think it's external as well. I know one of our customers actually raised that as a question remark a couple of years ago, where it was cleared in kind of the customer-facing function we were light on diversity. I think it was very clear that the senior leadership was all males. And they raised that as a kind of between concern to a why. And it was very, very fair. And I don't think that you're not yet probably heavily penalized for that, but it is definitely an agenda for many companies. And companies that have diversity, equity, and inclusion as part of their identity and DNA, they are more likely to notice it in others. What was really nice is, the same company, fast forward, I think 16 or 18 months, had an event, and we had a fantastic senior female leader joining them as a speaker and was able to talk about her journey and, her career, and talk to younger women and kind of as an inspirational leader. So, but I do think that it's important, on this point for companies, for all of us to hold each other accountable. I think it's really important to ask those questions, because it would help in making sure that diversity, equity, inclusion is part of the discourse, not just for International Women's Day or Pride or any other event, but it's part of it as we talk about revenue and gross profit. We will talk also about what we do on diversity.
One final question I'm going to throw in. How do you think the payments or fintech ecosystem is doing on this?
I think it's not doing great. I think it could do better. There are more women now that you see in senior roles. You see more people of color, gay people, etc. So there's definitely improvement. But it seems to not be equally done in all the different areas. So I think if you look into businesses in fintech, on the tech side, it tends to be still male dominated. If you look into sales, you still see probably more men than women. And other minorities seem to be a bit less visible in some areas. So there's a long way for us to go as an industry. I think that a lot of companies are much more aware of it. I think it's a lot more part of the discussion and agenda for many companies. But I think that we still have a long way to go.
Yeah. Well, one of the reasons I do this series and have done it for, I guess this is the fifth year, is to raise that visibility, because I think that awareness is incredibly important. And overall, this is an incredibly important topic, in my opinion. So I want to make sure that we've covered everything that you want to cover. Obviously, we have covered a lot, and I really appreciate you sharing everything. Is there anything else that you'd like to add before we wrap up?
No, I think exactly what you just said is really, really a key point. I think talking about it is really, really important. And I think it's really important for anyone who's looking to embark on a diversity, equity, inclusion journey. It's going to feel uncomfortable. When you start, it is uncomfortable. You're out of your comfort zone and you're forcing yourself to ask questions where the answer on them would be probably not as good as you would have liked it to be. But it's an important place to start, because if you really take it seriously, you can only improve on it. And then you look back after 12 or 24 months and you see how much progress you made and how that translated to change in culture, to engagement in the business, to the perception of the business internally and externally. It's a journey worthwhile taking. But it's not one day is easy, or there are no quick fixes here. You can't just wake up one day and turn the business from having no agenda in place to being fantastic at it. It's something that takes a long time to achieve, and then takes even longer because you have to keep going at it. It's not something you do for a year and then you stop. It's something that once you start doing, and you should start doing, you do it forever.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a great way to wrap up the show. So, Motie, thank you so much for being here today. I know your time is very valuable, so I really appreciate your opinions and your view and the DNA that you've built in that company and the culture you have there. So thank you so much for being on the show today.
Thank you for having me, Greg.
Absolutely. And to all your listeners out there, I thank you for your time as well. And until the next story.
Thank you for joining us this week on the Leaders in Payments podcast. Make sure you visit our website at leadersinpayments.com, where you can subscribe to the show and where you'll find our show notes. If you enjoyed listening, please share on your social channels as well.